Greetings and welcome everyone. This is session 2 of the Juvenile Policy and Code Development Virtual Learning Series hosted by the OJJDP Tribal Youth Resource Center. Today's session is entitled Philosophy of Your System, Findings and Purpose Provisions that Represent the Values of the Community. This is Laura Smith. I serve as a program assistant with the Tribal Youth Resource Center at Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and I will be walking us through just a few quick tech reminders for today's session before we get started. With that, I will hand things over to Anna Kluff, who serves as the co-director of the Tribal Youth Resource Center and lead for Healing to Wellness Court programming. Anna is an amazing human being. I'm grateful to work with her, and with that, I'm gonna hand it off.
Thank you, Laura, and likewise, Laura is all things on the backside, helps us get things moving and functional, and so very appreciative of her. We are joining you as part of the Tribal Youth Resource Center. We are currently housed at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and we are funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. We currently have a partnership with the National Native Children's Trauma Center, and we provide training and technical assistance to OJJDP tribal grantees, primarily Purpose Area 8, which is Juvenile Healing to Wellness Courts, and Purpose Area 9, Tribal Youth Programs. But we also serve any federally recognized tribe and try to fulfill training or technical assistance requests that come into our center. And our staff are located all over the country, represent many tribes, and I believe that as a team, we are unified in the belief that our children are sacred. So we are very fortunate and have such a wonderful opportunity to work collaboratively with many tribes across the country. So it's wonderful to be here today again on session 2, and we can go to the next slide. So again, we welcome back the Honorable Pat Sekaquaptewa. She is joining us from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I think she's in her home, but she is a part of the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development. She is a justice on the Hopi Appellate Court, and we are so happy to have her back here on session 2 and leading this series for juvenile code and policy development. So again, welcome back, Pat, and thank you again for being such a wonderful presenter, wealth of knowledge on juvenile code and policy development. Next slide. And that's me. I don't necessarily think we need my picture up here since I'm facilitating today, but I am very happy to serve as a co-director at the Tribal Youth Resource Center. Have enjoyed being a training and technical assistance provider for the past several years. Prior to that, have worked here in Oklahoma in various ways. Very fortunate to work with youth and families in many different tribal communities. Have worked as a prosecutor, and before working in the field of OJJDP, worked on a civil legal services grant that supported survivors of domestic violence. So a lot of different experiences working in the field. Really enjoy connecting with all of the tribes that are currently funded by OJJDP, and has been really great being part of the Tribal Youth Resource Center team. So I know that we still have maybe a few people joining. Hopefully people are starting to get logged on. I know we're in a different platform we're in GoTo, so if you would like to use the chat feature, we do like to open our sessions in a way that offers everyone in the room to connect. And so I just wanted to start today with sharing a word or a phrase or something that you value. If you want to share in your tribal language, if you want to If you're not tribal and you're joining and you don't want to share in your tribal language, you don't have to do that. But if you would like to share a word or a phrase in the chat box, something that you value, something that you cherish. I know a lot of people would probably say they cherish their family, their community, the youth in their community. But the reason why you're here, the reason why you continue to do the work that you do. So I'll give everyone a minute. You can use the chat box to type that in. We will read out the responses that we get, but we wanted to give a little bit of time for people to get in the room, get connected. And while we wait for people to type in, I will go ahead. We already talked about Purpose Area 8 and Purpose Area 9. Laura, you can go to the next slide while we wait. And I see some people typing in. Thank you to Tana. The concept of total wellness recognizes that our every thought, word, and behavior affects our greater health and well-being, and we in turn are affected not only emotionally, but also physically and spiritually. She shared that from Greg Anderson. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Pat, I know that you are joining us up from Alaska, and I know we all continue to face the impacts of COVID-19. We're all working from our home offices. Even through all that, I continue to cherish my family, my children, a mother of 5. So that's my thing that I cherish, my husband and my children, and very happy to be here. I've spent a lot of time with them over this last year at home, but it's been really wonderful to feel more connected to them. And Cherie shares the underrepresented children and families in her community. So thank you for sharing that. And we have more people share. I know that not everyone can see the responses that we get in the chat box, but we're going to continue to maybe talk about those as we go through the session. So continue using the chat box. We love hearing from you. We're going to talk about today's objectives for session 2. So this session is going to cover the development of juvenile justice processes that reflect local values, have the desired impacts, and have preferred outcomes. We are also going to talk about the development of processes that provide for meaningful behavior change, fairness, and accountability. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about ineffectual system responses that may thrust youth toward harm, may contribute to further delinquency, or may thrust youth toward the adult criminal justice system. So like our last session, we are going to be watching some pre-recorded sections of material, and then Pat and I are here. We're going to discuss after each section and answer questions that come up. So with that, we can go to the next slide, Pat.
Welcome to session 2 of the Juvenile Policy and Code Development Virtual Learning Series. This session is going to focus on the philosophy of your system and specifically on the findings and purpose provisions of your juvenile law. And because we've already done introductions, I'm going to jump ahead to slide number 8. So there are 2 learning objectives for this session. The first one is that we're going to look at the different views about what should be the philosophy underlying your juvenile justice system. And of course, there are a host of competing, conflicting, yet very important purposes and concepts to look at here. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the hybrid philosophical approaches of the Model Indian Juvenile Code. Okay, so let's go to our next slide. All right, so I have a diagram here that is illustrating the 3 primary terrains and some of the important concepts in each terrain that inform juvenile justice law and policy today. Now, many tribes and tribal governments over the years have been influenced by either state code provisions or Code of Federal Regulations provisions. There's no telling where or what combination of provisions we might have in any given tribal juvenile code. And so I think it's important to kind of look at the big picture to see what the different terrains are, so that we might be able to see where our laws have come from, or at least the laws that sit on the books today. So the three terrains are criminal justice law and policy, and then civil law and policy specifically dealing with welfare and social control, and then the extent to which those have been influenced by the findings in science, specifically science looking at adolescent brain development and behavior. Okay, so we're going to spend a good deal of time looking particularly at the welfare and social control law bubble here. So I'd like to talk about the general approach to regulating children under American law on the civil side here. So the state's authority to regulate children, there's two purposes really. The first is the state's parens patriae authority. You may have heard that term, parens patriae, and it's usually invoked when the government acts on the basis of society's moral obligation to care for its weak and dependent members, specifically children. The role of the state as parens patriae goes back hundreds of years in English history to the time when the king was the protector of his people, but it became institutionalized by progressive reformers in America during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And this parens patriae authority became the basis of the state's relationship to children. The second source of governmental power to regulate minors is the state's police power authority to promote social welfare. So a state government could, for example, use this source of power to ensure that children receive adequate care, or to invest in their human capital so they become productive and engaged citizens. And under this power, it's in the interest of society, which ultimately benefits when it gets educated, healthy adults out of this system. So the state exercises these two sources of power in its civil law and policy under this welfare and social control bubble. One of the other things I wanted to talk about here are particularly rehabilitation and the developmental approach. And we're going to see that these end up being a foundation of the contemporary juvenile justice system. And of course, these concepts are greatly influenced by the findings from adolescent brain development research. I guess maybe I'll say just one more thing about this diagram before we move on. Over more recent decades in the state system, the criminal justice bubble has tried to grow in a sense, where state legislatures have passed laws making it possible to either transfer younger and younger youth out of the juvenile justice systems into the adult criminal justice system, or they've circumvented the discretion of the judge, or they've legislated it away and gave discretion to the prosecutor to file cases straight into adult criminal court. And so we sort of see that criminal justice bubble getting bigger and bigger, and the welfare and social control bubble, which justifies the existence of a separate juvenile justice system, separate from the adult criminal system, that bubble getting smaller and smaller. So there are some competing values, concepts, purposes here on our diagram. Clearly, there has been a greater drive to deter youth who commit crimes, to find them culpable, to weigh in favor of public safety over, say, youth rehabilitation, and the developmental approach, the idea that you should modify your juvenile justice policy and laws to consider the state of adolescence and the underdeveloped teenage brain in deciding how you handle youth who commit crimes or offenses. People don't agree. And it turns out this has been the case over and over again for as long as people have had society and justice systems. And so we're going to take a look at some of that as we walk through the history of the formation of the juvenile justice system in the United States. All right, take a big deep breath. That was a lot. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit specifically about the history of the juvenile court and philosophical approaches in the United States. So it may not surprise you, or it may surprise you, that some of the early progressive reformers were women. And they were women who were college educated. They were middle class. They were religious women. They were women who cared about children. And they had an agenda. Their desire was to have more and more young offenders be viewed as though they were children under the law, so that they wouldn't end up in prison or jail or in the criminal justice system, as was the case in the 1800s. So by the early 1900s, we see their efforts start to bear fruit, and we see the establishment of a juvenile court in Chicago. And the mission of this juvenile court was to promote the welfare of youth who were involved in crime, and also to promote the welfare of children whose parents neglected them or abandoned them. The underlying goal here was to expand the boundary of childhood to include adolescence. In other words, teenagers could also come under this new juvenile system and not end up in the criminal system, because previously teenagers were subject to the same criminal responsibility as adults. So these reformers envisioned a court and a correctional system in which older as well as younger youth would receive rehabilitation instead of punishment. However, some scholars have looked back at their work and suggest that their intentions were mixed, that although they were concerned with child welfare, that they also had their own social control agenda, namely to Americanize immigrant youth and to minimize the influence of their parents who were foreign, who were poor, who were urban. There was an American assimilative goal that was also part of the progressive agenda. And of course, being Native, this jumps out at us, right? Because we're in the same era where we see a lot of Indian boarding school assimilation of Native people. And so this seems a problematic purpose. Nevertheless, the progressive reformers ended up changing the system in favor of youth, getting them out of the criminal justice system. Why were they doing this? So we're reminded that these progressives had faith in the effectiveness of rehabilitation. During this time, all kinds of things were changing. The profession of social work was established. The scientific disciplines of psychiatry and psychology were emerging. People were very optimistic about the potential to understand human behavior and to treat pathological conditions. So these reformers believed that all of this knowledge and expertise that was arising could provide a basis for treatment, and that there would be a way to get delinquents to abandon their criminal behavior. So in the 1900s, then, the rehabilitative model shapes the operation of the juvenile court. And as I said before, prior to this time, so for example, under the Old English common law, you could have a youth as young as 7 years old being held criminally accountable for behavior and receiving the same sanctions as an adult. And the reformers, of course, were trying to change this circumstance. So what happened? So by 1899, we see the first juvenile court, which is established in Chicago, Illinois. And then by 1925, we see juvenile courts in almost every state. And here I give you some examples from Minnesota. Their first juvenile court was established in 1905. It was for youth under the age of 17. And young people between the ages of 7 and 12 were presumed incapable of committing a crime. Over the age of 12, you were presumed criminally liable. And then the first set of statutes for delinquent children in Minnesota included these kinds of conduct: being incorrigible, being idle or absent from home, associating with thieves or other immoral persons, frequenting saloons. So you can see there's kind of a mix here of things that look like status offenses, conduct that would not be a crime if an adult did them, like being idle, for example. Let's see if there's any even juvenile offense. Oh, you can theft. I see theft in there. But this gives you an example of what some of these early juvenile courts and juvenile laws look like. Okay, so under the rehabilitative model of these early juvenile courts, the goal was treatment or rehabilitation. However, along with that goal came a very informal process. And because they kept the process so informal, there were no procedural safeguards like we see in a criminal court system. The trial or the adjudication process was not a criminal trial. There were no adversarial hearings. The purpose of the hearing, which was quite informal, was to figure out the sources of the child's criminal conduct, often just by asking the child. And then the judge would determine the correctional disposition that would set that child on the correct path. The sort of informal rehabilitative purpose here also impacted the process of disposition. So an easy way to think about disposition, remember, is it's what used to be sentencing. So in these informal courts, dispositions were open-ended. They didn't have time frames on them. In other words, they didn't have an end time. They were supposed to be rehabilitative. So the idea was that you were trying to treat this young person and they could be cured at some point in time. So you really didn't have to put an end date on that court order. The duration for which a young person was disposed of or maybe sent to a reform school bore no relation to the seriousness of the offense. So, in other words, they were sent away until they got better, but it was not at all connected. The length of time was not at all connected to the seriousness of the offense. Juvenile court judges had a lot of discretion. They could dispose of these cases based on their judgment about what a young person needed. And they didn't have to take into consideration the seriousness of the criminal conduct. The state legislature wasn't telling the judge, if it's a serious crime, you have to do X or Y. Instead, the judge just decided what the young person might need. Okay, what about the roles of the people involved in these early juvenile courts? So you typically would see a judge, a probation officer, a social worker working together on behalf of the young person. Also, there were mental health professionals that would diagnose and prescribe treatment, but there was no defense attorney in this process. Also, juvenile judges lacked legal training, and they often just met with young people in their chambers. And I actually was able to find a picture of that. So really informal process, lots of discretion in informality when the judge, in the way the judge handled it. This model eventually collapses in the American system. So by 1925, every state had established a separate juvenile justice system. And for about 70 years, it operated with its informal procedures. Its purpose was to rehabilitate children involved in crime. But by the 1960s, this starts to crumble. And by the 1970s, the juvenile justice system is in disrepute, pretty much collapsed, and there was a conceptual vacuum. So here are some of the criticisms of this early juvenile court. And these are criticisms launched by people on behalf of youth, people advocating on the behalf of youth. So they claim that adolescents charged with crimes were getting a bad deal in the system that was designed to serve their needs. They said the juvenile justice system failed to provide treatment, but at the same time, it maintained a myth that rehabilitation was its purpose. And because of this rehabilitation purpose, it could deny juveniles procedural rights that adults would have in adult criminal court. And so there were a lot of good reasons to criticize the early juvenile courts.
Thank you for listening to that first section of material. So we have a poll, and you can read all of the selections, but the question is, which top 3 concerns inform your preferred philosophical approach? So you can select all that apply when considering your own philosophical approach within your juvenile justice system. But there are several choices here: accountability, deterrence, proportionality, public safety, and rehabilitation. And I believe that each one of these was mentioned at some point during the first section of material. So go ahead and feel free to delineate those that apply to your current system or to the system you're interested in developing for juveniles in your community. And I will let people respond, and Laura can also provide feedback as people start to submit responses to that question. And just so, just for sharing purposes, that this is for purposes of our discussion. So your responses are to help guide our conversation.
We still have a steady stream of responses coming in, starting to slow down a little bit, so we'll leave it open for another 10 seconds or so. So if you haven't voted yet, this is the moment.
Thank you, Laura. I think for many of us who are either our background is working in the justice system or law trained or any sociological education in your background, I think that there's some maybe guiding definitions or some other knowledge you might have about why certain things would be chosen. So Pat, we have a lot of answers. Laura, I'll let you read out those percentages.
Sure thing. So we have 56% of respondents said accountability, so application of sanctions for conduct. 33% shared deterrence, so punishment that seeks to prevent future crimes. 37% shared proportionality, so punishment should fit the crime. 63% said public safety, preserving community safety, and then 78%, so the most of all, said rehabilitation, treatment, and more.
Thank you, Laura. So Pat, what do you think about those responses? Are they what you thought they might be?
Yeah, and just to double check, you can hear me okay, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So yeah, it's interesting that the contenders are always rehabilitation and public safety, historically, those are the two that really are in tension. If you think of the adult, not the adult, but the young adults who end up in the juvenile justice system, who tend to be, in some communities, they can be kind of scary, you know, like that drug dealing house down the road. And the question is, do you try to rehabilitate those folks, or do you protect the village? So that's fascinating. The other one that always strikes me is deterrence, because we're about to look at the adolescent brain development material, and it turns out that being hard on them doesn't deter them because of their underdeveloped brains.
Yeah, I definitely know that when you're trying to choose between any of these, it is those considerations for, you know, obviously we want our families and our youth to be safe, both individually and collectively. We want to focus on rehabilitation to support our youth and to hopefully set them on a different path when they do become involved with the juvenile justice system. And then, of course, you know, deterring that future behavior, but in a way that obviously ties into, you know, the methods that we're rehabilitating. So I think all of the answers that came in are close to what I thought they would be, but definitely appreciate all the feedback that we just received. So we will go ahead and move into the next section of material, and then we'll pause a little bit longer for discussion.
Okay, so we've been talking about how the rehabilitative era of the juvenile courts in the state system was collapsing. And the sort of demarcating point where we see things really changing is 1967, when the U.S. Supreme Court issues its opinion in a case called In Re Galt. And let me just tell you a little bit about the background in this case. So this is an Arizona case, and it involves a 15-year-old boy named Gerald Galt. He was arrested for making prank phone calls to his neighbor. And the U.S. Supreme Court later describes his conduct as being of the irritatingly offensive adolescent sex variety. And so Gerald ends up being brought before the juvenile court judge. He isn't given any notice of the charges. He doesn't have an attorney. The neighbor never shows up to appear and testify as a witness in his case. Instead, the arresting officer appears and testifies as to what the neighbor had described or reported to him. So the juvenile judge in this case commits Gerald to the Arizona Industrial School for up to 6 years. If this had been committed by an adult, the crime would have carried 2 months in jail and a $50 fine. So Gerald Galt ultimately ends up appealing this order, and he prevails before the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court, in an opinion by Justice Fortas, flatly rejects the state's justification for the informality of its delinquency proceedings. He describes the Arizona proceedings as a kangaroo court. He notes that delinquents generally got little rehabilitation and that what they received was ineffective, as evidenced by the high recidivism rate in juvenile crime. So the court concludes that youths facing adjudication in delinquency proceedings, like adults, had a right to notice of the charges. They had a right to confront witnesses against them. They had a privilege against self-incrimination, and they had a right to counsel. So Galt ends up being a watershed case in the history of the state juvenile courts. And the procedural changes that are ordered by the court here transform delinquency proceedings into more formal adversarial proceedings. So I wanted to cast this case in light of some of the history of the tribal court system. So this is 1967, and you'll recall that the Indian Reorganization Act period for tribes is between 1934 and 1940. So those tribes that organized under the Indian Reorganization Act by adopting constitutions and setting up their tribal councils, they were doing this in the 40s. And then that era was followed by the termination era between 1940 and 1962. So a number of tribes were effectively being undermined or disbanded, at least in funding, in the 40s and the 60s. And so those tribes were really in no position to be funding and operating a court system. Then we come to the self-determination era in 1962, which continues through to today, where we see tribal governments getting a lot more funding to elaborate their court systems. And just by way of comparison, my tribe, the Hopi tribe, established its IRA government in 1936 by adopting a constitution. It's not until 1972 that it passes a law that sets up its court system. So you can see here In re Galt is happening a number of years before the Hopi tribe even has a court system operating under tribal law. Now, prior to this time, and is the case with many other tribes in the West, they were operating a court system under the Code of Federal Regulations and under the direction of the Department of Interior. But these are different than courts that are established under the tribal constitution and the tribal code. And then at Hopi, it's not until 1981 that the Hopi Ordinance 35 gets enacted, which establishes a children's court, including the juvenile court. So there's quite a lag between 67 and 81 for my tribe, where they have a fully functioning juvenile court system. Now, that said, these U.S. Supreme Court cases governing the procedures of state juvenile courts did not apply to the tribal court process. And so they're not binding. But the experience of the state courts and the dynamics that they were undergoing are informative to tribes because we sometimes experience the very same things. The other thing to remember is that if your tribal code was copied from a state court code or a state juvenile code during this era, you may be copying in provisions into tribal law that were influenced by these experiences. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we've been talking about how in the state court system, the original rehabilitative model was collapsing. And then, of course, with In re Galt, that very informal juvenile procedure was now being required to be more formal, with more rights protections and looking a little bit more like the adult criminal court process, more adversarial. Now, during this post-Galt era, we also see state law changes that really restructure, if not completely undermine, the rehabilitative model. And so the scholars ask what went wrong with the rehabilitative model. And they note that the model failed to recognize and accommodate a tension that existed then and that recurrently exists in all juvenile justice systems. And that is the tension between the state government's purpose of acting in the interest of young people and the conflicting interest in protecting society against those young people who are engaged in criminal conduct. And this same tension exists in the tribal juvenile justice system. All right, so by the 80s and 90s in the state court system, lawmakers were changing the laws and they were getting more punitive with respect to juveniles. And they were shifting the age boundary for which they could prosecute criminally young people and take them out of the juvenile court system. Now, there's a whole bunch of types of laws that were used to do this across the state system. And I've given you a list here on slide 19 under legislative reforms, but I'm only going to talk about 3. I'm going to talk about the lower age of judicial transfer. I'm going to talk about direct file statutes, and I'm going to talk about blended sentencing statutes. Okay, so even prior to the 80s, a number of states had a little piece of law in their juvenile code that were called transfer provisions. And these transfer provisions allowed the juvenile court judge to determine whether a particular young person coming into the system should be instead handled in criminal court instead of the juvenile court. And so this is what they mean when they say judicial transfer. So during the 80s and 90s, during this sort of more punitive era, the state legislatures were lowering the age of judicial transfer. So now you could have a 10-year-old who could be transferred into the adult criminal court and criminally prosecuted. And of course, these age boundaries vary by state. So these transfer provisions allowed for an individualized determination made by the juvenile court judge. They acted as a safety valve to recognize the importance of public safety and to acknowledge that not every young person would benefit from the services provided by the juvenile court. The inquiry by the judge focused on whether that young person was likely to respond to interventions, and the judge would often look at things like, have past treatment efforts worked? Is this young person malleable? Is this person generally pretty immature? Should they stay in the juvenile justice system? Okay, so another kind of law that got passed during this era was something called a direct file statute. And this is where the legislature gave the prosecutor the authority to file charges against a young person in either juvenile court or in the criminal court. And of course, this completely circumvented the juvenile judge who had previously had the decision-making authority to decide, after really looking at the situation, where that young person should go. Another kind of more recent statute is called a blended sentencing statute. And this kind of law allowed the young person to be initially processed in the juvenile court, but they might be convicted of a felony and they would be subject to a really stiff sentence in juvenile court. And the juvenile court would remain holding jurisdiction over them during, until they became 18, and then thereafter they could serve out their the remainder of their time in adult prison, right? So an example is given from Texas, where a juvenile court sentenced a young person to 40 years for a felony. And then that young person would serve out the remainder of that time after their 18th birthday in the adult prison system. So most blended sentencing statutes included a procedure where when that young person turned 18, there was a procedure for determining if the adult portion of the sentence would be carried out, or a provision suspending the adult portion of the sentence for young people who had not violated institutional regulations or probation conditions. All right, so there's a whole bunch of different mechanisms here. None of these are in the model juvenile code. The point of this part of the presentation is to note that during the 80s and 90s, there were increasingly more punitive and public safety oriented provisions being put in state juvenile laws. And if your tribe copied a state code originating from this era, you may have some of this in your tribal law. And so you just want to note the era in which there was an influence on your law drafting and make sure that it's the way you mean it to be. Okay, so what was going on in the 80s and 90s? So there was, during the mid to late 80s, a violent crime wave in the state system. And by 1993, this really starts to drop. If you look at the little figure on the right here. So the crime wave definitely starts to drop, but that doesn't stop politicians and the media from having sort of a heightened look at young people and street gangs. They were depicting young offenders as super predators. And so you sort of see a lag where the lawmaking and the politics is really focused on more punitive responses, even though crime rates are actually dropping with respect to youthful offenders by the mid-90s. So that media attention and political attention focused the public on this idea of the young super predator and caused them to think of the juvenile court as being too lenient, focusing on treatment instead of on the crime problem, failing to hold young offenders accountable for crimes, and even thinking of the juvenile court as contributing to encouraging them to engage in criminal activity. But the scholars who have looked at this ask us to have a reality check about this period. They point out that by the 1980s, after the Galt case, juvenile courts had changed. They had much more formal procedure. They also focused on public protection and accountability, and that this was reflected in the kinds of dispositions that juvenile judges meted out in juvenile court. So not only were the crime rates going down, but accountability and public protection was more of was a thing in the juvenile court orders. Okay, so I wanted to just come back and check in on the model juvenile code here, and particularly I wanted to look at the purposes section in section 1.01.110. So in the model code, I'm really seeing a hybrid approach. I would say there's a hybrid approach to the purposes of this model juvenile code, but it tips in favor of rehabilitation and therapeutic interventions. So we can see some of that here under A, B, C, and it will go on to, I think, D, E, F. And we'll look at all of those here for a second. So under A, you can see that a purpose in the model code is to secure the welfare of children. And it's interesting that they characterize all youth all the way up until age 18 as children. Another purpose is to preserve and retain the unity of the family whenever possible. And under C, there's a desire to distinguish between the child who's committed a delinquent act and the child in need of services. So here they're saying, look, there's a difference between status offenders and juvenile offenders. And we're going to treat status offenders as though they're children or families in need of services and not as offenders at all. Okay, let's look at the second half here. So the other purposes in the model code include to remove from children who commit delinquent acts the legal consequences of criminal behavior, and to substitute instead programs of supervision, treatment, and rehabilitation. And that these programs will do things like hold them accountable, provide for safety and protection of the community, but also promote the development of competencies which will enable them to become responsible and productive members of the community. And also to set forth procedures through which the provisions of this title are to be executed and enforced while ensuring that their rights are protected. And then finally, another purpose is to coordinate the services that go along with all of this, that emphasize prevention, early intervention, and diversion to community-based alternatives. So I guess what jumps out at me from the model code is that we're definitely going back to a rehabilitative place in the purpose of the model juvenile law. However, those programs are to be carried out with to accommodate that tension of sort of looking out for public safety and accountability. That is worked into the programming, probably in the diversion aspect of these juvenile courts. And the tribal healing to wellness courts come to mind with their sanctions and incentive structure, where they respond to whether or not a young person is participating in their treatment and how they're doing. Right? There's all those graduated sanctions and incentives in there. So there's an accountability component in the tribal healing to wellness courts. Okay, I'm going to stop there for now. And
so we have another poll, and then we're going to pause for some discussion, because I know we just took in a lot of information. Very good. So the poll question we have right now is, which purposes are the most difficult to meet in your system? So please select one: to secure the welfare of children, to treat status offenders differently from delinquents, to replace criminal consequences with programs, to recognize and protect rights, or to coordinate services for children and families. So which purposes are the most difficult to meet in your system? And we'll pause for just a little bit to allow people to respond. And just want to encourage you all, those that are our panelists, we can see when you submit a question or in the chat. So feel free, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please type those in. We are going to have some discussion. I believe we have a couple of questions in the question pod right now. So we'll talk about those as soon as we close out this poll. But Laura, I'll let you see how many people are responding and then what kinds of feedback we're getting.
Great. Yep. Responses are still coming in. So far, oh, actually, no, I won't share what we see yet, just to not influence anyone. We'll leave it open for just another 10 seconds or so. If you haven't voted yet, please do. Good to have as many voices as possible here.
Thank you, Laura.
All right, and with that, I will share the poll. All right, so to secure the welfare of children, we had 22% of respondents share that. Treating status offenders differently from delinquents, 11% of respondents shared that. Replacing criminal consequences with programs, just by a tiny bit, the strongest response that came in with 33%. Recognizing and protecting rights, 6%, and finally 28% of folks shared to coordinate services for children and families.
Thank you, Laura. So Pat, I'll let you make any observations or comments about the results of that poll as far as the responses that came back in.
Yeah, so I think it's consistent, maybe a little surprising in the number one, which is to replace criminal consequences with programs. And as you saw from the history, a lot of our juvenile laws at the tribal level have been inherited or influenced by often very punitive, criminally focused process. And so cleaning that up is a big task. All that reworking of code and structure and court process is a big task. So that makes sense to me, the 33%. The services, coordinating services, is what I thought would come out on top, because it takes a lot of money to provide services, much less coordinated. So I thought that would be high, but it's still pretty high at 28% compared to the others.
So I know we had a couple of questions that came up during this section of material, and I know that for me, we're taking basically a picture back in time into how the juvenile justice system, where we've arrived in present day, and looked at those very early years of development. And so I think, the comment that you shared, which was, why are we going back to look at all of these purposes and these particular policies in the different eras? And it is because we know that many communities may have adopted local law or looked at local state statutes, and maybe in part or in whole or in piecemeal may have adopted different sections of juvenile code. So when you think about the philosophies and purposes of the state rather than that of the tribe at the time, just merely for purposes of getting some sort of code down on paper, you're looking at how do we sit down present day and look at what our specific purposes are, and based on that model code, I know that we had a question that came in that was talking about what about Indigenous justice approaches? And I think for me, looking at the model code statements, that you could definitely in the purpose statement integrate some additional commentary there that talks about recognizing traditional restorative or rehabilitative approaches, especially if you're looking at the implementation of things like the wellness court or peacemaking or other restorative approaches to support the youth in your juvenile justice system. But I'm going to read a couple of questions for you, Pat. So we have a question that says, this is very difficult as all areas are significantly needed. As this is just in response to the poll, including securing the basic welfare of our children, given the siloed systems set within the states. This is not within my professional realm, so programs, I think it's a commentary about programs and treatment and trying to secure the welfare of children, and then coordinating formal intervention. So I think really just some commentary on the difficulty to try to meet all of these purposes. I think, many people find meaning in all of those specific purposes that are listed. And so how do we develop a system that's responsive in all of these different areas?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And indeed, that's why the first rehabilitative system in the state system failed, because they weren't able to actually have the services and programs at a sufficient level. And tribes have that problem too, and they have the added problem of having to coordinate with other jurisdictions to provide services, and not everybody will play ball. I do know in the early years of the tribal healing to wellness courts, a number of tribes brought grants in to pull service provision straight into the court. So the court would have its own treatment provider, the tribal court. So there is a strategy to bring things in-house if you can secure the grant funding. Otherwise, you're back in the world of memorandums of agreement and team building and working with people until you can coordinate. Okay, maybe I'll hold off on that answer and see if Anna has thoughts.
I was just going to talk about, and we've had this conversation a couple of times, wanting to enhance your system by bringing in a wellness court or implementing an approach that has all of those different service providers, but then wanting to ensure that there's that continuity of care for youth. And so what we don't want to do is bring youth into a system and then have codified that these are the types of services that will be offered. And then, for example, that funding ends and you're not able to sustain the program for whatever reason. What are the other options, or how are you going to codify or ensure that the policies you develop offer some alternate path in the instance that those programs cease for whatever reason? I mean, obviously we're hoping for sustainable programs, but we know that in some communities, if providers are limited, behavioral health services might be limited, for adults and for youth populations. And so I know that that's something that comes up a lot. So I think I had this discussion with you a couple of years back, and we were talking about, do you codify certain things, or are those things that you put in policies and procedures, but can be referred to by code, and they're just adapted as different services are available in the community?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that I should just say out loud that all this code work that we're talking about is on the juvenile court side, and it's not so much on the wellness court side or the programming side. We're just looking at how your tribal court is moving cases over to your wellness court or your traditional dispute resolution or your circle process. We're making sure you've got your foundational doors open in your code, in your law, to do that. And that's always the more technical stuff to focus on.
I'm going to check our questions and where our little box is lighting up a lot more now. Most funding for juvenile justice has specific criteria and ties funding to data, and reducing crime as the only measure of success, allowing tribal governments the authority to what, who, how, and when to use the funds and work with youth and families. So a push for more open use of funds, so that there's not those very prescriptive measures on the backside. And I'll let Pat share about that.
So I haven't written a federal grant proposal for a wellness court in the Trump administration. I did a lot under the Obama administration and before that. And all we had to show was a reduction in recidivism. We didn't have to show like crime. Well, I guess that is crime prevention, but we didn't have to show outright crime prevention, just that our recidivists were recidivating less over time. Yeah, I guess that would be my answer.
Yeah, I think that it can be difficult because there's that delicate balance of, the utilization of funding streams, and at the same time, there's measurements that are occurring for the allocation of funds. It's a constant battle, I think, and balance for both the agencies and then the sites, because the site is more aware locally of what's really needed, and then the community is really the one with the most knowledge of what are we hoping for as the outcomes for this program. And obviously it is to look at the reduction probably in delinquency amongst their youth if it's a delinquency program grant, but really looking at supporting youth, rehabilitating youth, offering them more opportunities within the system as it stands. And so hoping for those more positive outcomes, reducing the risk factors that they face. But I think from what I see, the performance measures that are tied to some of the current funding, they are a little bit more open. I have heard that there's some discussions about a change in some of the performance measures. I don't know if they're going to be broader. I haven't seen them yet, but I know that that was something that was in the works recently. So we have a couple of more sections of material, and I'm watching our time. So let's go ahead and move into our third section of material, and then we'll pause again for discussion before we move into the last quarter.
We've really been talking about the history of the juvenile justice system in the state system, starting all the way in the late 1800s, coming forward into the 1990s. And we're still seeing changes in the state and tribal law and policy. Most recently, we're starting to see movements in response to the findings of the adolescent brain development science, particularly coming from the behavioral and neurosciences. But it's still a murky area. It's still complex, and it's still changing. So what I thought I would do is go ahead and select some of the seemingly relevant discussion points, particularly from the work of Dr. Lawrence Steinberg, to see if it might have relevance for tribal juvenile justice policymaking, and also to see how the model code reflects or does not reflect what some of the discussions are. So I picked these 4 subtopics: age boundaries, judicial discretion, sentencing, and education and corrections. And let me just share what Dr. Steinberg's perspective is on these 4 points, and then we'll go back and look at the model code. So the first category is age boundaries, and Dr. Steinberg notes that the neuroscience will not tell us exactly when an adolescent brain becomes an adult brain. Nevertheless, there is a strong argument for treating adolescents differently than we treat children or adults. And the topic that most often comes up is culpability. How blameworthy are adolescents for their misconduct during this phase of their brain development? The second category is judicial discretion, particularly the discretion of a juvenile court judge. And Dr. Steinberg would argue that juvenile judges should be given more discretion or flexibility to treat individual adolescents differently because they're adolescents and they have an underdeveloped brain, and we're not able as a group to say, by this age they have an adult brain and should be more culpable, but it's a case-by-case kind of thing. The third category is sentencing, otherwise known as disposition in juvenile court. And he's suggesting that differential sentencing should turn not simply on the state of adolescence, the fact that a young person has an underdeveloped brain, but also on his or her ability to change or mature, because they are maturing, they are changing a lot during this time of life. Their brain plasticity is very high in adolescence, for better or for worse. And then the fourth category is education and corrections. And again, he's pointing out that during adolescence, positive and effective educational experiences are critical, because this is a time when the brain is the most plastic, the most changeable. And if we're putting young people in corrections facilities, they need to be having a positive educational experience at the time when their brain is undergoing the most change, right? That would be the for better instead of the for worse. And he also points out that for the most part, our correction systems are not set up to provide this kind of education or positive environment for young people. All right, let's talk a little bit about the findings, sort of the big picture findings of the science. And, if you look up articles or papers on these topics, you're sort of presented with these 3 findings: self-regulation, response to rewards, response to stimuli. So let me say a little bit about each one of these. And I preface this with, I am not a neuroscientist and I am not a behavioral scientist. But this is what I make of it. So since the late 1990s, researchers have developed brain imaging technology that allows them to see what is going on in the teenage brain. Particularly, they're able to see and track the physical changes in the brain and the patterns of activity in the brain. So for example, there were some studies where they were imaging teenagers while they played video games, and they could see how the brain lit up when they won awards in the game, like gold coins, or they moved to the next level. They were able to see that in the imaging at the same time that it was happening. So the first area is about self-regulation and self-control. And they can see that in the adolescent brain, the brain systems important to self-control continue to become more effective all the way into a person's early 20s. So they're still changes going on that impact the ability of that person to have self-control. With respect to response to rewards, adolescents have a heightened sensitivity to reward, and it motivates them to engage in risky acts when the potential for pleasure is very high. And studies of the impact of peers on adolescent brain activity have shown that adolescents' hypersensitivity to reward is particularly pronounced when they are with their friends. And this helps explain why their risk-taking, including criminal behavior, so often occurs in groups. So they note that group situations actually exacerbate the very deficiencies in judgment that are thought to mitigate an adolescent's criminal responsibilities. And I had to read a whole bunch of state cases in preparing this lecture, and I remember this one story of this kid who was maybe 13 years old, and he was playing video games with like a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old, and the older adolescents say, "Hey, let's go rob the neighbor." And so this 13-year-old, very concerned that he would be seen to be a scaredy cat, and also he didn't want to be left alone, went with them, and the older adolescents end up murdering the neighbor, while the 13-year-old is hiding under a table. And of course, the 13-year-old ends up getting tried as adult, ends up going to adult prison. But this particular response to rewards and pleasure and risky acts jumped out at me as really, this kid was only 13 years old. He really didn't have the machinery to not go along to the neighbor's house with these much older adolescents. And his brain just didn't have the ability to say no in that circumstance. Okay, let's go to the third one, response to stimuli. And this has to do with the difficulty that adolescents have in regulating their feelings when they're responding to stimuli. So the kinds of arousing stimuli they're talking about here are things like pictures of angry or fearful faces. So an adolescent sees that someone is looking at them in this way, and they have difficulty regulating their feelings. This ability to process things emotionally and to have self-control improves as regions of their brain governing emotional processing and self-control become more interconnected. And as they mature into adulthood in their 20s, their susceptibility to peer pressure declines. They become less likely to overreact to threats or perceived threats, and they're better able to put the brakes on impulses aroused by their friends. Okay, so all this brain imaging technology and the scans that they're doing are showing us that our brains undergo a massive reorganization between about our 12th year and our 25th year. And the more general findings tend to be that adolescents are more susceptible to peer influence, they're less oriented to the future, they're more sensitive to short-term rewards, and they're more impulsive. And so the really big question is, how might these findings be relevant to juvenile justice policy and law development?
So this poll question is, teenagers should not be punished or punished less for impulsive conduct, risky behavior when with friends, overreacting emotionally, all of the above, none of the above. So the question is, teenagers should not be punished or punished less for impulsive conduct, risky behavior when with friends, overreacting emotionally, all of the above, and none of the above. And I'll be quiet if you like to read the questions and give everyone a minute to respond. Laura, when you see responses start to filter in, you can let me know a good time to look at the results of that poll.
Will do. Thank you everyone who's responded so far. 32% of y'all have voted. Please keep the responses coming. We'll leave it open for just a few more seconds. All right, Anna, I will close the poll and start sharing the responses. All right, so half of everyone who responded shared all of the above, followed interestingly at 33% with none of the above, and overreacting emotionally came in at 17%, and no one picked either of those first two options.
Okay, so I think probably about what we thought as far as the responses, especially based on what was just shared in that previous section of material. And I know that we've had some pretty significant discussion with different communities that we've worked with regarding age limitations and considerations in serving youth in their juvenile justice systems. I know specifically with the Healing to Wellness Court, there are a number of courts that are looking at the age of services being provided in the wellness court up to the age of 21. I think when you consider the specific needs of tribal youth and some of the issues surrounding the transition between that older teenage years into young adult years, having that bridge of time to be able to continue to engage with those youth and continue to offer services or move them into some kind of aftercare program is very important. I think that it can help with sustaining some of those positive behavior changes that they make if they are involved. And I'm speaking specifically about the wellness court, but I know that just in the general juvenile justice system, we have a lot of youth who are served by their communities in the court. If they are court involved, we have prosecutors or others who are working with them over extended periods of time. And I think that many people would see that if you're seeing positive behavior change and you're hoping to sustain that and keep them diverted from the adult court system, having the capability to provide services for additional years can be really helpful. And I see a couple of questions, and I know Pat's connection, she was trying to reconnect quickly. So I'm going to just check the question pod. Laura, I don't know if you can check to see if Pat's been able to reconnect. We can hold the questions till the end if she's not able to be on right now.
I think I might be here. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. I'll go ahead and read this question. This is more of a comment. I don't agree with the term punished, disciplined according to the seriousness of the outcome. So just a comment, some commentary about terminology. I think both Pat and I would agree. I think as a center, we definitely promote the use of strengths-based language. I think we're talking in terms of a Western-based framework as far as that specific question terminology. But then there was another comment just about the questions. So no new questions. There was just some commentary about the poll prior to it being opened. So just because we're close to time, I think we'll move to the next section of material. And then Pat, if there's any wrap-up questions, we can address those at the end.
Okay, great.
Okay, so let's take a look at the Model Indian Juvenile Code of 2016. And in particular, we're looking for provisions that might reflect influence by the findings in adolescent brain development science. So the first category is age boundaries. And we'll recall that Dr. Steinberg says, as a practical matter, you have to have age boundaries. The neuroscience won't give us a specific age boundary, but we do know that the adolescent brain is undergoing a lot of change between about age 12 and age 25. So the model code actually has two categories of definition for what is a child or who is a child. And under its first definition, a child is a person who is under age 18. And that's the classic delimiting age, right? 18. We see that in a lot of state laws. But there's also a second definition of child, and they define a person who is 18 years of age or older and who is alleged or found by the juvenile court to have committed a delinquent act to be a child. So just let that sink in for a minute. They're defining a child to include people who are 18 years of age and older who are alleged or found by the court to have committed a delinquent act. Why would they do that? Because as per the recommendations of those applying the findings of adolescent brain development science to juvenile policy and law, they appear to be sort of holding the door open for tribal juvenile court jurisdiction over dispositions for adolescents in their early 20s, I would say, so that the treatment services and other things that a juvenile court might coordinate for a young adult could still happen under the model juvenile code, where that person has been adjudicated to have committed a delinquent act. Okay, lots of fancy words here, but I do see some evidence of influence of the science here. Okay, let's look at the second one, judicial discretion. So I wanted to find an example of where the legislature left things for the judge to decide, where there's more judicial discretion, and an example where the legislature took some discretion away from the judge and told him what to do under the model code. And so the example of greater judicial discretion is where the code says the judge has the discretion to determine whether a child is in need of supervision, treatment, or rehabilitation, and to make an appropriate disposition, or in other words, sentencing. So I guess my observation here is that those are areas where the judge would have had discretion anyway, whether or not the code said it. But they do specifically use the word discretion in the code for these categories. An example of where the legislature is saying the judge has less discretion in the model code is with respect to sentencing or disposition. So the model code does require the judge to enter an order deferring disposition. So what I get from that is they're saying, hey, look, judge, you usually should defer sentencing. You should hold off on having an order sentencing this young person to something. In those cases where you do go right into sentencing, it has to be where the judge has determined that the best interest of the child or the community can't be adequately addressed through a diversion option, like sending that young person off to a tribal healing to wellness court program or some other diversion option. So the model code is tying or binding the hands of the judge a little bit here, but they're doing it in favor of rehabilitation or some other therapeutic option. And that's completely the opposite of the state court experience where state legislatures were tying the hands of judges to send more and younger youth into adult criminal court with more punitive sanctions. So in the case of the model code, the less discretion is in favor of rehabilitation. All right, this is complicated, I know. The third category is specifically sentencing. And Dr. Steinberg is saying that if a judge sentences someone, the difference of the sentence should turn not just on the fact that the young person's brain is underdeveloped, but also on the ability of the young person to mature during this time. So the question is, does the model code take any of this into consideration? And what we find in the model code is that it does require the judge to consider the following things in its sentencing. It needs to consider the nature and seriousness of the delinquent act. It needs to consider the age and mental and physical condition of the child. The judge needs to consider the child's culpability given the circumstances of the particular case and the past record of delinquency. So these considerations don't seem to specifically have to do with the adolescent brain and its underdeveloped status, or on the ability of the young person to change or mature. But I do see doorways in this language where a judge could consider those things, particularly in thinking about the age of the young person and their mental and physical condition. That's definitely some language a judge could use to think about the adolescent brain. And maybe even culpability, right? How blameworthy is this young person given the state of their brain development? Okay, well, this would all happen in the decision making of the judge under the code, but the code doesn't explicitly provide for different sentencing given the state of adolescence or the plasticity of the young person's brain. Okay, the fourth category was education and corrections. And remember, Dr. Steinberg was saying that our correction systems are just not set up to provide a positive or educational experience for young people whose brains are the most changeable during this time of life. And the way that I see the model code reflecting this is that it just simply doesn't favor secure juvenile detention as a sentence for young people. It provides for that possibility, and we can look at the next slide here. But it does limit how judges sort of order secure detention. So the model code requires that a judge shall not enter a disposition providing for detention unless, and then there's this laundry list of things that the judge has to make sure about before they order secure detention. And the first one is there can't be a less restrictive alternative that you haven't tried already. Can you send them somewhere else first? Also, there must be clear and convincing evidence that the child should be detained because they're a risk to health, welfare, person, or property. There's a substantial risk that they might leave or be removed from the jurisdiction. And if you're going to detain them, there have to be 3 conditions that are met. They have to have repeatedly failed to comply with orders of the court. Least restrictive alternatives for placement have to have repeatedly failed. Also, detention has to be reasonably calculated to bring them into compliance. And in no event shall a child be detained in a secure juvenile detention facility for a total period exceeding that for which an adult could be incarcerated for the same act. So remember that In re Galt case where that poor kid was sentenced to up to 6 years in a facility. And if an adult had committed the same conduct that he did, an adult at most could have gotten 2 months in jail. So those outcomes are very unfair, right? Where a juvenile is being detained for long periods of time for conduct that an adult would never have been subject to. Okay, so we've done a lot today. Your brains might be hurting. I know mine is. And let's just sort of draw back and look at the big lessons of what we moved through today. So first, the whole point of this second session was to look at the philosophical approaches that might inform the purposes of your juvenile law in the first place. And we need to remember that the law that is on the books in your system right now might have been inherited from a bygone era of the Western system. And so you need to go back in and review the approach in your juvenile laws to ensure that you agree with it, that the purposes underlying it are your intended purposes, and also that there's a cultural match for your particular community. Second lesson learned, the tribal juvenile justice system under the hybrid model code approach should be fair. It should balance therapeutic and cultural goals, but it should also balance the goals of accountability and public safety. And the model code does this through programming. Okay, the third lesson learned. The model code is a hybrid approach in terms of purposes and philosophy. It's trying to do multiple things, to look out for the welfare of children, to preserve and retain the unity of the family. It's trying to remove the legal consequences of criminal behavior for children committing delinquent acts. It's doing this by substituting programs of supervision, treatment, and rehabilitation. And these programs, inside the way they're made up, hold children accountable for their actions. It provides for safety and protection for the community, and it promotes the development of competencies in young people. Also, the code ensures that the rights of the parties are recognized and protected, and by parties they mean young people and their families. And then finally, the model code requires the coordination of services for children and families, particularly those that emphasize prevention, early intervention, diversion, and community-based alternatives. All right, the big lesson learned from the adolescent brain development science, or we know from the science that the adolescent brain is a developing brain, which has the following implications in the tribal juvenile justice system. The first big one is that adolescents should be treated differently than adults with respect to juvenile court jurisdiction, and disposition orders, and culpability of adolescents. Young adults should also be treated differently than adults. Judges should be given flexibility by the tribal legislature to treat adolescents differently based on their individual circumstances. Differential sentencing should take into account the developmental stage of adolescence. And if adolescents and young adults are detained, they should be provided with educational experiences in detention. Okay, so that was a lot to cover for today. I hope this will be helpful in your policy and law discussions going forward.
I know we had another poll, but I know we are closer to the end of our time together today. So I wanted to just go ahead and share a few comments that were in our comment box. And so we had a comment that was talking about not agreeing with the term punished, disciplined according to the seriousness and outcome. So just terminology, again, a discussion about terminology. A comment that punishment is a Western approach, and traditionally in my tribe, we are children until our parents pass away. And so I think, Pat, we've shared, and I know we're going to be moving into a lot more deeper conversations about terminology, language, designing the system around community and cultural values, specific and individual to the tribe itself. And so there's a lot more time and room for further discussion on these exact topics. And I know that they'll come up in some of our future sessions. So I'll let you share quickly if you have any commentary before we close out today about that.
I just want to say thank you to everybody for taking the time to go through this technical code work. It's important to know the legal side of it to protect your kids. And it's important to be able to have a real opinion about those code provisions and not just let the lawyer draft it over your head, because they may not be from your community. They may be copying from the outside, and who knows where their source material came from. And it will be punitive if it came from the 1980s and 1990s. So thank you, and join us again next time for sure.
Yes, we will continue our conversation with Pat. I know an hour and a half is definitely a short amount of time when we have a lot of information to cover, but our hope is that through the next 3 sessions, we'll get to have even more intensive conversations about how to develop policy and code for your juvenile justice system. Please invite others who might be working on these projects with you, because I think being able to take in the information together and then develop a committee or otherwise who might be working on updates to your code or changes to your code, starting off on the same page, having experienced this training. So we look forward to session 3. Laura, I don't know if there's any slides left, I think there's an evaluation link. So Laura's going to share that, and that is all we're going to cover today. So thank you very much.